Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
Often memories of junk food stimulate our cravings to overeat, even weeks after we've quit eating it. Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your host today, speaking with Dr. Guillaume de Lartigue. Dr. de Lartigue is an associate professor at the Monell Chemical Senses Center and holds an appointment at the University of Pennsylvania Pearland School of Medicine. He got his doctorate in molecular and cellular physiology from the University of Liverpool. His postdoc training includes work in the gut-brain signaling at the University of Liverpool and sensory neuroscience at the University of California. Dr. Lartigue's research focuses on the neural and gut-brain mechanisms underlying eating behavior, food-related memory, and the development of obesity. I came across his work when I discovered the National Geographic article, How Junk Food Outsmarts Our Brains by Hiding in Our Memories, published in the April 17, 2025 in the National Geographic. This article is based on a study published in Nature Metabolism, which shows how neurons in the memory part of our brain, the hippocampus, can actually stimulate cravings and lead to overeating even when we're not hungry. Dr. de Lartigue, what got you interested in the neuroscience of food cravings?
Well, first, thanks for having me on. I really look forward to our conversation. To answer your question of how I got interested in this topic, I've been studying the neurobiology of eating behavior for nearly 20 years now. I started as a graduate student working with Graham Dockery at the University of Liverpool, like you mentioned. And there I was studying how information about meals is communicated to the brain. And then I moved to the University of California, Davis to work with Helen Raybould, where I was looking at how this communication is altered in response to eating high-fat, high-sugar diets. And so when I started my own lab about 10 years ago at Yale, I was working with Yvonne Desrougeau in collaboration, and we showed that the gut-brain axis doesn't just tell us to stop eating, but it also plays this critical role in reinforcing food intake. And last year, we actually published some data showing that fats and sugars act through kind of separate parallel pathways along the gut-brain axis. And when foods combine both fats and sugars, it enhances our drive to eat. So I've always been fascinated by this question of how the brain controls feeding. And while we often think of hunger as something that arises from the stomach, or maybe when our energy levels drop, it's clear that past experiences or learned associations will also shape what we eat, when we eat it, and how much of it we choose to eat. And so this is something that I've just been interested for a very long time.
We in the food addiction world talk about hunger that's actually not because of physiological emptiness or an energy deficit. We call that false hunger. Do you have a distinction between that kind of hunger and true hunger, as it were?
Yeah, so I think we typically think of hunger as like two main types of hunger. There's your metabolic hunger, which is triggered by energy needs. So, there's physiological cues like a drop in blood sugar levels or an empty stomach, for example, and that would be associated with this type of hunger. And then there's this other type of hunger, which is what we typically call in the field hedonic hunger. And this is driven by pleasure and reward. And so even if you're actually not hungry, just seeing the slice of cake, for example, or smelling fresh pizza might trigger this desire to eat. And so that would be the hedonic hunger.
That's what we call food addiction hunger. But you have something else, which is called memory cued hunger. Can you tell us about how the brain stores memories of fat and sugar specifically through those distinct pathways that you mentioned?
Sure. So the hippocampus is the area of the brain where memories are typically thought to be formed and retrieved, specifically episodic memories. So these are memories that are tied to a specific experience in time and in place. And so when we have a meaningful experience, and this could be a good experience, celebrating some event with friends around some good food, or it could be a bad experience, something that causes fear, for example, there's a specific group of neurons in the hippocampus that become activated together. And it's this network of co-active neurons that forms the basis for a memory trace that we call in the field an engram. And so later, if you reactivate this engram, it'll bring back the entire memory back online.
Wow.
So this system allows us to learn from our past experiences. They'll allow us to make predictions, to make future decisions by linking the memories to specific contexts. What the hippocampus is doing is it helps us to flexibly and appropriately respond to new situations based on previous experiences.
That's really an explanation for how post-traumatic stress disorder can develop, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So this is not specific to food. This is specific to just any type of memory, episodic memory.
Relate that to food then, please.
So what our research shows is that fats and sugars are processed through your gut. So when you eat the food, it gets into the gut, and then it activates a kind of gut-brain pathway, which is what we study. And then it can lead to distinct outcomes in the brain. We have a few different studies. And in one study, we found that the different populations of neurons in the hippocampus, which again is this brain region that's involved in memory, are activated in response to fat or sugar. And these nutrient-specific neurons will help the animal remember when they encounter those foods. So what we found is if you delete the neurons, for example, that respond to sugar, the animals will forget where that sugar was found, but they'll still remember where to find the fat. And vice versa, if you delete the fat neurons, they can exclusively no longer remember where the fat is located. And so what this suggests is that there's fat and sugar that create separate memory traces in the brain. And interestingly, we found that if you actually delete these neurons that store the information for fat or sugars, that this actually helps to protect the animal against gaining weight on high fat or high sugar diets. And so this suggests that the food memories themselves can drive eating beyond hunger by reinforcing where to find the foods and the motivation that the animals have to seek that out again. That's the one study. And then there's another study in which we found that fats and sugars, again, acting through these different gut-brain pathways, actually trigger dopamine release. And so dopamine is this key component of reward. And we found that if you have foods that have both the fat and the sugar together in the same food, that'll activate both the fat circuit and the sugar circuit together simultaneously. And that results in even more dopamine being released than either one of the nutrients alone. And so this can help explain why some of the ultra-processed foods that have combined both fats and sugars together are really especially strong motivators of intake, even when we're not hungry.
We understand food addiction. We know about the dopamine pathway. We look at sugar and there's even before we eat the sugar, the anticipation of the sugar will drive our desire to eat it. But you're adding the extra piece that there can be memory, so that if I have the recollection of something that's sugary or fatty, that will drive the craving as well.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly the right idea.
And how would you trigger that memory? That would be like cues like smell or visuals?
Right. So the memory is formed from any event that is associated with the ingestion of the food. So yeah, it can be smells that are associated with it. It can be visual cues. It can be just remembering that it's on this block of a certain street. Yeah, any cues that relate to the act of eating will be triggering of this memory.
Which would be even like if I always eat in front of my Netflix TV at night.
Correct. Right. So just any event that's related to the memory, where you eat, what you eat, how much you eat, all of that stuff is stored in the brain and is a trigger for subsequent meals at later time.
Tell me if this makes sense, that for a food addict, somebody who's been eating this food exclusively, they're supercharged, as it were, because there's overlap of neurological associations, that it's akin to a post-traumatic stress event. Like there's an explosion of connection that is beyond our ability to say no. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think to some degree. Earlier, I mentioned this concept of engrams, which is when a group of neurons fire together. And the more the neurons fire together, the more they start wiring together. And so the more you're likely, just from a very quick cue, to activate this pathway. So I guess in some ways, it's similar to a traumatic event. In trauma, you have in fear conditioning, you have exactly the same engrams forming in the same brain region. They're different neurons, they're different subsets of neurons that fire differently together, but it's the same concept. The physiology is the same.
Yeah, okay. Even the fear of withdrawal, like how will I live without my Netflix and food binge, will also contribute as well. So that negative memory can contribute.
That's an interesting concept. So all of our experiments have been done associating positive memories with food. And so I'm not sure how the withdrawal of a certain event would lead to, it could absolutely be associated. And certainly just the act of watching Netflix, for example, could make you suddenly think, oh, I need to eat because that's what I always do when I watch Netflix.
These cues are far stronger than our metabolic needs.
They're separate pathways, and so one can override the other, absolutely. So in this case, these memories, these reinforcing cues can overcome the actual physiological need to eat.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And also the desire not to eat, like a person's on a diet and they're trying not to eat. By way of illustration, explain how you're walking by, we have in our subway system a pastry store that pumps out the smells of the pastry to draw people in. So from the time when the person smells that, what's happening in their brain till the time that they're buying this thing that they really don't want to be eating?
I guess when someone walks past a bakery and then they get the nice smells that you're talking about, they can suddenly maybe crave either the bread or a pastry maybe. But it's not just about the smell, it's about the entire memory that's associated with that event. So the scent itself is a powerful cue. It'll reactivate those neurons in the hippocampus that forms this engram. But these neurons help retrieve all the details that are associated about the calories that this food contains that creates the positive reinforcement, the taste and the smell of the pastry that they previously had. Once this is activated, these neurons then send links to brain regions that are involved in reward. And it tells your brain basically, this is something that's worth going back for again, something that you've had that was pleasurable, that was good. And so this memory-driven system can really trigger a strong desire to eat based on the past experience.
This would explain why diets are so hard, because you're fighting against this sort of evolutionary designed thing to make you go back to the energy-dense foods.
Yeah, and one of the challenges with dieting is that you're constantly in a state of hunger as well. So you're physiologically hungry. And so all of the cues are actually things that you're focusing on even more that maybe you would normally be able to ignore. When you're hungry, these cues are even more reinforcing. So yeah, dieting is really hard.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that if it's strong enough, like maybe a new food that you've just been introduced to can lay down these engrams. Can stress enhance this process?
So I'm not sure that one experience per se is enough. So in our experiments with the mice, they were able to form these long-lasting memories off of just a few exposures. So in our case, it was 3 exposures in a single day, but it was usually a food that they were familiar with from before. So that was sufficient to create a really strong memory trace in the brain. And these experiences were activated through these different distinct hippocampal neurons that store fat and sugars, and that helped to guide their kind of future nutrient decisions. But once these are formed, these food memories then persist over time. So they can be reactivated by the contextual cues, by just the smell or the taste or whatever cues you can see in the environment. And that can happen weeks or even months later.
Yeah.
So it's not just the act itself is acute. I think it takes a few relatively brief encounters with these calorie-dense foods to then have this long-lasting imprint in the brain that continues to influence cravings well after the food is gone. Now, how stress influences that, it's clear that stress actually, it's interesting because stress can have 2 effects. In some cases, if you're stressed about an exam, maybe you don't want to eat. In other cases, when you're stressed for a long time, then maybe that drives you to seek out comfort foods. So different people respond differently to stress. And that's actually a really interesting area of research that I know some people are looking into. What is the different triggers and why do different people respond differently to stress? But certainly if you're in a category where you're seeking out the comfort foods, then again, I think it is a memory-driven response, that you're looking for something that can alleviate the negative feelings that you have internally.
So I would imagine that if these connections are made young, they're even stronger, these engrams.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's true that the developing brain is really sensitive to environmental inputs, including food. So during childhood and adolescence, there's neural circuits that are involved in reward, impulse control, and memory. And these are still maturing. And exposure to ultra-processed foods, for example, foods high in fats and sugars, during this period specifically, can actually shape the brain's reward system in really lasting ways, potentially making individuals more responsive to food cues, more prone to habitual eating. And there's a growing concern that early frequent consumption of these foods can strengthen the neural pathways that link food with habit, and then increasing the risk of overeating and diet-related health issues later in life. There's definitely a lot of work happening in this area.
So these
more is needed.
These neural pathways that you're calling engrams?
So I would say it goes beyond just memory, just the dopamine circuits as well, the reward circuits. Okay. Yeah. All of that together is involved.
Any comments about in vitro, like if mom is eating particular foods?
Yeah. So there's clear evidence in the literature that what the mother is eating during pregnancy will influence, and this is done in animals, the pups, once they become adults. Just that 3-week period in the rodents can have a really long-lasting impact when re-exposed to these types of food in adulthood.
Okay, now I think that there's some talk about genetic component to this, the ANKKI gene. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so there's work by a number of people showing that ANKK1 is a risk allele for obesity. So there's this genetic variant that it's near the ANKK1 gene that it affects the expression of dopamine-2 receptors in the brain, and specifically in the reward areas. And I think it was Paul Kenny and his lab that found that dopamine D2 receptors are downregulated in reward centers in obese animals. And that actually, if you go into a normal animal and you knock down the amount of dopamine receptors in the striatum, that this results in the onset of compulsive, like food-seeking behaviors and overeating specifically of high-fat foods. And then work by people like Dana Small, for example, has shown that individuals that have these genetic profiles of ANKK1 genes and dopamine D2 receptor expression patterns, they show greater activation in reward areas in the brain when they're exposed to cues for high-calorie foods like a milkshake, for example. And so this suggests that for some people, the food cues may feel more compelling or harder to ignore, and potentially increasing their vulnerability to patterns of overconsumption.
What about sweeteners, artificial sweeteners? How do they confuse the picture?
Yeah, so artificial sweeteners, they're sweet and they have no calories. That's the kind of definition of an artificial sweetener. And what they do is they can confuse how the brain perceives carbohydrates by giving mixed signals. Yeah. So it's a sweet taste, and a sweet taste will normally predict the caloric reward that you get. And so the brain uses this association to guide its learning and its memories. But what artificial sweeteners do is they decouple the sweetness from the calories. And so studies have shown that if there's this mismatch, that can blunt how the brain responds to the real sugar later on, because it's thinking that sweetness doesn't predict calories as well. And so this will impair the metabolic and the neural responses that occurs. And so this can interfere with the formation of accurate food memories. It can potentially disrupt the brain's ability to regulate sugar intake in future.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, how could that actually impair somebody who's trying to maintain or lose weight?
In large part, the reason that we consume certain foods and that we like certain foods is because of the calories that they have. And so we're actually very efficient at predicting from the taste how many calories we're consuming. So if there's a mismatch over a long period of time, and we're no longer able to predict accurately that this level of sweetness leads to this number of calories, and that the mismatch is with non-nutritive sweeteners, predicting that sweetness has fewer calories, then we're likely to eat more sweetness to get the number of calories that we need. And so it's just creating a mismatch in the brain about how much we should be eating based on the sweetness that we're tasting.
So in other words, it affects our satiety messages because we don't feel satisfied. And so we're continually eating more to get that satiation.
Yeah, to some degree. It's basically that we're not able to fully assess just based on taste how many calories we're consuming. And so as a consequence, every time we consume real sugar later on, we just think, oh, there's no calories in here. And so I need to consume more of it.
This explains what people talk clinically all the time. They feel that their stop switch is broken, that they think that having a couple of pieces of chocolate will do the trick, but it doesn't, because they just are constantly wanting more.
Yeah. So the other thing, so it's interesting to think about who we're talking about and under what conditions we're talking about. So in individuals that are obese, the taste itself is highly reinforcing, but the calories are not as reinforcing. And so they're highly motivated to go and consume the food. But then when they consume it, they're not getting the satisfaction, the pleasure from the food that they're expecting. So they need more of it. Yeah. And so they're motivated to consume it and then not getting the satisfaction from eating it. In obesity, I don't know how that translates in other individuals.
It certainly translates exactly in a person who's experiencing food addiction, which is that whole drive that you're talking about, but not necessarily with the weight attached to it.
That makes sense.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. So it explains why that stop switch is broken, because it literally is. We've lost our ability to gauge our caloric content.
Yeah, so that's definitely what happens in obesity. There's definitely evidence that the physiology changes so that we're no longer able to detect in the same way. And, in obesity, what we really need to be doing is going in and fixing that problem, that physiological problem.
Then let's get to treatment. Do you have any comments about treatment, or are you really just looking on the front end of things? For example, you mentioned a little earlier, if you could actually zap those memories of sugar or fat, the animal wouldn't be seeking it out anymore. Do you have anything at all treatment-wise that is possible?
So that's what we're working on. We're hoping that we'll get there soon. So what our work shows is that there's these two really strong forces that contribute to overeating, specifically these calorie-dense foods. So there's the memory and there's the reward, and those are two separate components. So on the memory side, the brain kind of stores these engrams, this kind of detailed records of like past experiences, and they tie it with the specific foods. And that will include not just what the food is, but where it's located and when they were eaten. And then cues in the environment, like the smell, the location, the visual reminders, whatever they are, can then trigger those memories and drive us to go and seek out that food. And then on the reward side, the foods that are rich in fats and sugars will activate dopamine release. So there's more dopamine released when the nutrients are combined. So understanding these mechanisms, I think, can help us guide treatment approaches. Yeah. So for example, strategies that will reduce exposure to the environmental cues or retrain our brain's association with certain foods can weaken that pull for the food-related memories. And then on the reward side, treatments that could aim to reduce the excessive dopamine responses to the foods, whether those are dietary changes, behavioral interventions, or even pharmacological tools. Ultimately, what we want to do is address both the memory and the reward pathways together to have a more effective way of treating the problem.
So with the memory side of the equation, would that be tools like desensitization, using again the language of trauma? You put yourself in that cue-driven environment, but don't eat. And so trying to break that connection, is that possible?
Yeah, that's the kind of behavioral approach that we can use. Try to weaken the food-related memories to reduce the exposure to the cues that trigger them. So that's just take yourself away from any tempting foods and put them out of sight. Yeah. Maybe avoiding certain aisles in the grocery store, or if on social media we're following certain companies that might have food-related content, maybe unfollow those. But yeah, like you said, also on the flip side of that, if you could form competing memories by either pairing those same cues with a healthier behavioral option, that's one option, or put yourself in that situation that triggers the cue and then don't eat that food. That type of behavioral approach can help to reshape the hippocampus so that those associations are dampened and now you're forming new associations with other things.
Yeah. I guess that's where we see that in the food addiction world, is where the person first avoids, avoid the hedonic cues in the first place, right. And then over time reintroduce the environments. Like now you're able to go to a wedding, you're able to go to a movie, you're able to go to a party, but don't indulge and instead do something else, help out at the party. So cueing different behaviors, healthier behaviors in the face of that memory context.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the behavioral approach. What we're really hoping to do with our research is actually develop drugs that might be effective at actually dampening the activity of these hippocampal neurons that are associated with food-related memories.
What kind of drugs?
We haven't figured out what that is yet. What we're looking for now is the kind of molecular signatures of the neurons that respond to the fat and to the sugar, so that we can then develop the drugs, figure out what are the receptors that are located on these drugs, so that we could target those neurons specifically and dampen their activity, so that it just makes it easier for people to resist all the cues that are in the environment, essentially.
Yeah, and it would still be driven hedonically, but they wouldn't be floored by the memory that is itself a cue.
Correct. And actually, so in our experiments with the mice, when we silence these neurons that are for fat or sugar in the hippocampus, we actually prevented the animals from developing obesity when they were fed high fat, high sugar diets.
That's interesting.
So to me, that really shows that this is like really strong proof of principle that actually, if we could target these neurons, we could actually really help people maintain first a healthier weight, but also open this door for new therapies that could dampen our motivation, our drive, our thinking about these foods. And just there's this concept of food noise. I don't know if that really applies to this specifically, but if we could tone down the cues and the noise around us that drive us to overeat, then maybe we'd still have the pleasure, we'd still have the motivation while we're eating, but we're not constantly being driven to overeat based on our environment.
Exactly. Like you enjoy the food and then it goes away until you're hungry again.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you mentioned the word food noise, and that's often used in the context of the GLP-1s. How would that fit into this scenario, either with medication or just memory? Does it affect memory at all? I know it affects the hedonic aspect outside of, obviously, the metabolic. Do you think that it might have some role to play in the memory-driven?
Yeah. So it's hard to know. So medications, so we're really talking about things like Ozempic, right?
Yeah.
So Ozempic definitely acts in the brain, and it acts particularly in regions that are impacting hunger and reward. So it acts on both, and it's likely it contributes by acting on both of these regions simultaneously, it reduces cravings.
Yeah.
So Ozempic works by acting on GLP-1 receptors in the brain. And so GLP-1 signaling can dampen brain reward systems. And there's growing reports that people that actually take these GLP-1 based drugs experience reduced motivation for food, but also for other things like alcohol and other addictive substances as well. But it's not really clear if it's directly acting on the hippocampus and these memory circuits that we've identified for fats and sugars. What I think is probably happening is that it's lowering appetite, so you're less hungry. It's dampening the reward responses. And so what these drugs are probably doing is indirectly reducing the pull of food-related memories. I think that still needs to be tested.
Okay. So moving back to the memory piece, if you do find a drug or the receptors, will they be selective enough that you're not destroying other ability to create memories?
Yeah, I think so. That's the key question, right? What we don't want to be doing is not being motivated to eat food, but also forgetting everything that happens in our day-to-day lives. And so in our experiments, we did test this, and we found that selectively silencing the neurons that are involved in fat and sugar had no impact on other memories, non-food related memories. It didn't impact working memories for fats and sugars either. So the animals, we did this test where we would put them in a cage, and then with lots of different options that they could go to. And one of them had the fat or the sugar. So the first time they go in it, they're looking around, they don't know where it's going to be. And then we wait 5 minutes and we put them back. And so a normal animal will go straight to the right place. They'll have learned from that first experience where the right location is. And we found that deleting these neurons doesn't impact the ability to remember just a few minutes later where that food is located. However, what it prevents them from doing is remembering in the long term all the cues in the environment that are associated with where that food is located. Yeah. So it's very specific. It's unique to the specific foods. If we delete the fat neurons, it doesn't impact sugar memory. So it's very specific. It's unique to food. And so I think if we could dampen the activity of these neurons, we could really have a very meaningful effect on food intake.
You mentioned the concept of long-term, and that's another issue that is a real problem, that people will find sobriety. Basically, we're working in a field where people are avoiding sugar and fats. They can be abstinent, which is the term that we would use, for 3 years. And still, they're dealing with cravings when they walk into an environment like a pizza place.
Yeah, it's really tough. And the challenge with foods as well is we have to eat. If you're trying to stop taking drugs of abuse or alcohol, you can stop taking them and you can survive. You can't survive without food. So I think if there really is such a thing as food addiction, and you're constantly being reminded of it all the time because you have to eat to survive. So yeah, it's a really difficult thing to overcome.
And the long-term effect, like how long-term are we talking?
The long-term effect of
these engrams.
As far as we could tell, they didn't go away. I think what you can do is you can reshape them. I think you can lower the triggers. You can reduce how much they're firing together. And I don't think you can ever make them completely go away. Once the neural circuits are formed, it's very hard to unform them.
Yeah, so eventually have the person, rather than avoid the triggering situation, like the movie with the popcorn smell, to desensitize that smell instead. Like that would be the next step in treatment, because then memory will never really go away unless you work with it and remold it.
I agree. I think that's unfortunately true. It makes it very difficult because you're always it's hard to know when you're going to have a trigger.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to know when you're walking around when it's going to happen and where it's going to happen. So that makes it really difficult. It never really goes away. And there's certain things you can do within your own household, right? You can not have the triggering foods around. You can try to avoid certain shops if you know that in your kind of day-to-day life. But as soon as you go out and you experience a new environment, it's impossible to predict what's going to happen, right? Unfortunately, unless you can retrain and make new associations, it's going to be really hard. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's not something that just happens overnight either.
Okay, and another phenomena that we see in the food addiction world is that people will find that they were fine eating particular foods, and then after, I don't know, a year or 2 or 3, they can't eat those foods anymore. And that doesn't make sense hedonically or metabolically, but it might, this memory third pathway might be the piece. Like, for example, a person can eat nuts, peanuts, then one day have a real binge of peanuts or cashews, that's a better example. And then they can't eat them anymore because now they can't stop the next time. And that's got to be because of the memory of that one occasion that was very rewarding, and now they've remembered that. Does that make sense?
And it's probably something from childhood as well, when these memories are made particularly strong and these associations are made. It's hard to overcome it, but I think the important thing to recognize is it's not really our fault that this is happening. I think that's a really important message that the biology is telling us. And what's happening is we have this modern ultra-processed foods everywhere, and they're engineered to exploit our brain's reward and memory systems, and it makes it really hard to resist them. And so if you're ever feeling like your brain is working against you, that's because it is in many ways. These circuits have evolved from our ancestors to seek out these calorie-dense foods for survival, right? And we needed to be able to find, okay, where's the fats? Where's the sugars? I need to be able to find them. I need to be able to consume them in order to survive. But they're still doing their job today. And the problem is we don't live in that same environment. We're now living in an environment where there's foods everywhere, these types of foods everywhere. But I really do think that the system can be reshaped. I think that's the positive kind of take-home message from all of this. So you can change your environment to some degrees to reduce your exposure, like we talked about, to the cues. And you can build new habits that help to prioritize the less processed foods. And then some of the research that we're doing and that others are doing in this area are hopefully going to lead to new treatments that will target these biological drivers that lead to overeating, so that people don't have to just rely on willpower, because that's when it makes it difficult. If you're struggling, it's not really a personal failing. It's just how powerful these brain circuits are. But I would say it is possible to change them.
And the food industry deliberately manipulates, obviously, the hedonic aspect and the metabolic aspect, but they also manipulate the memory aspect by triggering all sorts of irrelevant memories to these foods.
The whole idea of marketing and logos is really based around this concept that the logo itself will trigger the memory or the wanting of certain types of food. Everybody, if you mention a kind of a yellow arches, everybody knows what I'm talking about, and that will trigger a memory of itself. The companies are very good about marketing their logo and making these associations, and they're playing on these memory circuits that we have.
Yeah. You mentioned sugar and fat, and specifically fat. Generally, we don't see, quote, fat addiction, people overeating on fat alone. It's usually in the context of sugar and fat, especially salt as well, very hedonically rewarding. But fat itself, what's the value of fat with memory or anything else?
So fat packs more calories per gram than anything else.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely something that, at least from an evolutionary standpoint, would have been something that we definitely would have seeked out. Now, if you think of our ancestors, fats would have probably come in the form of meat that they would have had to hunt and kill the animal and eat it that way. So it would have been not something that would have as easy access to. You might remember the general location and patterns of where the animals go and graze, but it's not as easy to find. I think sugars, we definitely have very strong memories of where those are located, because usually those are fruits or things that we're growing. So we know exactly where they're located, and we can come back year after year and know that they're going to be in the same location. So I do think that memories for sugar are probably stronger than memories for fat, but rewarding component of ingesting fat and ingesting sugars they both exist, and they've probably both evolved separately because there were very rarely in nature foods that had both fats and sugars combined. And so we needed these separate circuits in order to remember, okay, the fat's over there, the sugar's over there, and have the reinforcing cues associated with that be separate. But now, of course, we live in a world where everything is combined together, and it triggers both of these two circuits simultaneously.
Yeah.
I would say that fats are to some degree reinforcing, but like you said, it's the combination of fats and sugars that's even more reinforcing.
Yeah. There's very few people who will eat a tub of lard or butter, like a butter stick, without any sugar attached to it at all. But that makes sense that there's two separate pathways, because in nature, we don't usually have the opportunity to eat them both in one thing, except,
right.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned that basically if somebody's feeling hopeless, that this is their brain working against them, and that we have some tools that have to be deliberate attempts to alter the environment to work against that, to reset ourselves.
Absolutely. And I think that the take-home message is, again, that it's not our fault that we get triggered by these cues. They're designed that way. The combinations of food are not natural in the sense that it's not what we would find in nature, but we've identified that they are very pleasurable, very rewarding, very reinforcing. And as a consequence, we form very strong memories around these cues. We form memories for the cues that are associated with these foods. And yeah, it's a perfect storm. I think to some degree, the food industry was ahead of the science.
Yeah.
They knew what they were doing. They'd done not the types of tests and experiments that we're doing in the animals, but they figured out that what works. And what they've done is they've hit on these kind of evolutionarily conserved circuits that exist in the brain, and they've hit on those to ensure that we buy their products.
Yeah, on all three avenues, the memory, the metabolic, and the hedonic.
Correct.
All three avenues. And just to make it even worse, they're getting the young, where the young developing brain is especially susceptible.
Really, for us, the only thing that we want to do moving forward.
What's next for you? Yeah.
Yeah. What we want to do moving forward is, again, pinpoint the kind of molecular signatures of these hippocampal neurons that store memories for fats and sugars, and then develop some kind of precise drugs that can help to reduce the influence without affecting other types of memories. And then hopefully, if we can achieve this, we can have these tools that have long-term beneficial effects to help people in these conditions. But the one thing I will say is, in order to do all of this work, we really need continued support for the type of work that we're doing, which is ethical animal research. And the only way that we can study these kind of multi-organ systems, we're talking about the gut, we're talking about the brain, how they talk together. In order to do this, we need funding. And there's been this attack against science recently, and especially here in the US, where they're talking about reducing animal research. But we can't do this without the animal research. We can't make progress. We can't make new discoveries. All of the advances that have made with Ozempic, for example, in developing Ozempic, that was all done through animal research. And all of that work takes time, it takes resources. And I'm hoping that people listening to this and hopefully our government will realize that we need to make these right investments that I really think can make big changes into how we then deal with and prevent food addictions and obesity.
We have a final question that we always ask people, and that is, if you could tell a younger version of yourself something about the ultra-processed food that you eat, what would it be? Or about obesity, what would it be?
So is this typically like a one-liner? Am I going back in time and I get one line?
You can have more than one line.
And so if it's just one line, I would say that your brain can remember every food that you've ever enjoyed, and those memories are designed to then pull you back in for more, even when you're not hungry. Think about every time you put food in your mouth.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful one-liner. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time and talking about your research.
Oh, thank you for having me on. It's been really enjoyable.
Very fascinating.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group, I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.